And welcome everybody. Thanks for taking a few minutes on your busy day to listen to us chat about evidence generation strategies for enhanced market access success. That's our topic for today. And so we've got an esteemed panel that's going to talk to you about how to unleash the power of evidence, in the quest for successful market access and business adoption of your technology, which doesn't happen automatically, as we all know. You can have the most creative widget in the world, and it still may struggle from a commercialization standpoint if you don't have the right strategy and approach, and you don't have the right evidence. And so we're going to talk about those challenges, why they're there, and how you can penetrate through them, and have a successful market access initiative for your technology. So here's our presenters today. We have 5 of us here, 4 from Baker Tilly, and Peter Bannister is a partner of Baker Tilly's, and I'm just going to briefly introduce each of them, and then they can each chime in as they enter the fray here during this discussion today. So I'm David Gregory. I'm a principal Baker Tilly. Lead the market access practice here within the healthcare consulting group. Have been in the market access space for 20 plus years, started by helping Johnson & Johnson back in the days of the drug-eluting stent, and then fast forward to today, still helping a lot of larger entities with their market access needs, as well as startup entities for sure, in both the med tech and pharma space. I'm a former hospital and health plan administrator on top of that experience. Arun Parakat is a managing director at Baker Tilly, and Arun will share a little bit more of his background when he comes up on stage. We've got several questions for Arun, during this panel discussion, but he's got a deep and distinguished background in market access and commercialization. He is located in the EU, so Arun is going to be delivering some of the OUS, outside the US, perspective on today's panel for sure. So looking forward to hearing from Arun. Grace Macalino is a PhD. She's an epidemiologist by profession, and has been with Baker Tilly for a year plus, but has done a lot of great research work, in the AIDS space and other important public health, research initiatives. So happy to have Grace on the panel today. Keith Needham is a senior manager, and one of our lead guys on our market access initiatives. Keith is published in the peer-reviewed literature multiple times over with health economic studies that he's helped us with here at Baker Tilly. And so happy to have Keith on board. Keith also has provider and health plan experience before coming to Baker Tilly. And then Peter Bannister, very interesting background. Peter, happy to have you on board today, and thrilled to hear what you have to say about this important topic. Peter's, as I said, very interesting background. He's got a doctorate in medical imaging, interestingly enough, and that initially led to some AI technology, for preventative maintenance in the airline industry. So Peter, I would expect a call from United Airlines, any day, with some of their recent issues. So Peter, if your phone rings while we're on this, you can take it if it's United. But all kidding aside, since then he's done a lot of commercial development of solutions ranging from novel surgical devices to chatbots used to improve physician access for rare diseases. Peter's a very talented, creative guy. He's currently the managing director of Romilly Life Sciences, and is a UK health tech policy advisor. And he's also an honorary professor at the University of Birmingham, and very much look forward to Peter's comments as well. So that's our esteemed panel for today, and we're looking forward to these learning objectives. So we are going to go one by one, and we're going to understand the importance of having an effective strategy. We're going to recognize the criteria that payers and agencies use. I mean, it's all about the stakeholders, and we have a firm belief that when you generate evidence, you should be thinking about multiple stakeholders, not just doing evidence generation for one stakeholder at a time, but thinking more broadly about doing evidence generation that's got some multi-stakeholder meat to it. And that can be more cost efficient and more timely as well, for sure. And then the objective number 3 is going to be to identify the various evidence generation strategies and kind of ways to accelerate. And then the 4th one will bring up the rear in terms of what ROI. And Keith Needham will be bringing us home with that 4th one there. Okay, next slide. So, just 2 minutes of background from me, and then I'm going to, somewhat get out of the way and ask the panel to, to start, chiming in. But many of you probably know that, development of product in the pharma and the med tech industry is not easy. It's a multi-year process. You can see 12 years for a typical pharmaceutical, 7 years for a typical medical technology. The expenditures can be over $1 billion for a blockbuster pharma drug. It can be, tens of millions of dollars for a blockbuster med tech, and I think that number actually may even be on the low side, right? But and then the average success, right, of 5 of 25,000, receive some sort of marketing approval, and so that is not a high batting average, for sure, with regard to success. And then the length of time, to get reimbursement for these things. Like I said, it could be super creative, and may even meet an unmet need, but still can hit a lot of speed bumps with regard to reimbursement and overall market access. And you can see that it's approaching 2 years, once you have approval to actually get reimbursed. So so certainly just wanted to set the table with the fact that this is tough work, and it can be long work, and it can be even longer and tougher if you don't plan ahead, right? I think that's the major theme for today. Next slide. Just more background on the fact that about 50% of all, this is specific to pharma, are due to limited market access, followed by poor understanding of market conditions, right? So there are a lot of reasons why things fail, but 50% are connected to some sort of market access issue or some sort of misunderstanding of the market that you're targeting. So it's super important that you do that strategy work up front, and part of successful market access is, of course, understanding your market for sure. And then the other stat there is over 40%. Underperformed Wall Street's forecast for them, when they were in development stage, right? So there's a lot of excitement. There's certainly a lot of excitement early on with the advent of a new technology, but the bloom comes off the rose to a certain extent if you don't plan accordingly, right? And that's what the experts are going to talk to us today about, is how to plan and how to avoid some of these statistics. We don't want you to be one of these statistics on the wrong side of it, right? We want you to be on the right side of these statistics for sure. And it's all about, at the bottom there, generating evidence about clinical benefit and cost effectiveness, and facilitating affordable and timely care to the right populations. And I do emphasize, and I'm going to turn it over to Grace, but I do emphasize that one of the other key reasons for failure is not targeting the right population, and you need to get very specific about that. And I think that will come up during the session here as well. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Grace Macalino, who I've already introduced as an esteemed epidemiologist, to kind of take us through Objective 1. Grace?
Everyone, great to be here. Really excited to focus a little bit now our discussion on the importance of having an effective evidence generation strategy. Next slide. My background, as David mentioned, I'm an epidemiologist. I come from a very sort of classic academia trained perspective, but as a director here in our medical affairs and scientific strategy, it really is, how do you bring that science to be valuable to life sciences and med tech organizations? We do know that evidence is valuable across life sciences and med tech companies and really meets the goals of lots and lots of different, sometimes the science lives in a lot of different silos, right? Supports commercial efforts, HEOR, health economics and outcomes research, folks in medical affairs, market access, chief medical officer. But you can hear, right, that it's still all the evidence required to answer different questions for these different stakeholders, really ultimately address eliminating gaps, multi-use of information, and then the value of having this sort of integrated approach really impacts time and money. You get to save time and money, and really to provide a roadmap for the future. Next slide. So, we don't think that there needs to be sort of a differing perspective or a need from a scientific as well as a business perspective. Ultimately, if your evidence strategy is successful, you're actually able to align those business goals with scientific goals, right? In the end, if you're answering important questions for disease area, or that will, it should make a difference for the brand, and really being thoughtful from both sides of that coin, I think is most valuable, right? So making sure that, as David originally mentioned, that you're not just doing science for science sake, but you're answering questions that are going to be valuable for the brand, as far as basically ultimately getting patients access to the latest treatments, right? We always talk about getting the right drug or med device to the right patient population at the right time is the ultimate goal. And really, all of those things can be met with valuable, rigorous research, right? A product that will ultimately reduce the disease burden, right? This sort of puts a nice overview to what we're talking about, treats unmet needs, right? You add additional clinical benefit, and then ultimately is cost effective, right? We can't just think about this in a vacuum. How well does this drug or med device do all by itself, but really in the landscape of what already exists as far as care out there for a patient population. We do need to do these studies in the construct of, making sure that you address rigorous scientific methods, that you're answering regulatory approvals that are required for your drug or for your med device, and that you're able to answer questions that are important to your different stakeholders, right? Ultimately, we say, again, they shouldn't be so different, but what a patient might care about or need at the beginning might be very different from what a payer needs to really see to understand, like, hey, is this something that I would like to be able to cover and include in my formulary or such, right? What are those local prescribing guidelines and things you need to pay attention to? More and more, we can't think locally, right? We have to think broadly and understand. No, that's okay. You can move to the next slide. You have to understand, not only is this, how well does this drug or med device do locally, but, what does local mean when you think globally, right? So how do you take data from the United States and be thoughtful about how that might apply to different patient populations in Africa, in Asia? And really, you can hear the value of, okay, there are things about an evidence generation strategy that you really cuts across biologically. It shouldn't make a difference, but then there are local, social, cultural, economic reasons why you want to be very thoughtful about how that applies to your local scenario. So David, that was my big picture overview.
Great. No, thank you, Grace. So let me just ask you a question or two here, Grace, sure. and then we'll go to objective 2. But so what do you think what are the key components of an effective evidence generation strategy? You've kind of outlined them, but if you had to say the top 2 or 3 components, what would they be?
Great. So we like to say there are 3 sort of domains, if you will, that are really helpful to be focused on, right? You definitely want to always be thinking about sort of what phase or of science is the field ready for as it relates to your device or your drug, right? What gaps are you trying to answer to make sure that people, the evidence you're creating really addresses and understands, okay, here's the current state of what's going on in the science, and here's where and how my drug or product is going to answer the question. Then the next thing would be to sort of prioritize and think about your stakeholders, right? Given where you are in your evidence generation pathway, how do you prioritize? Where and how are there synergies? Some of these studies can take a really long time, and where you're able to be thoughtful about answering multiple questions, as you had mentioned earlier, David, I think is really important. And then ultimately, how much resources do you have available, both time as well as money, to put towards these efforts? And where can you be thoughtful and smart, right? Nowadays, we do have a lot more access to real world data out there to be able to answer and create real world evidence. So really being thoughtful about hey, you don't have to do it alone and create new prospective studies all the time. There are opportunities, and we'll talk a little bit more later in our presentation here about the value of using existing data that might not have been collected for research purposes, right? But you can really be thoughtful about how do you use and rigorous methods to be able to garner scientific insights.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Grace. And what about on the other side of things? The challenges you've kind of mentioned a few that along the way, which is kind of the flip side of having success is encountering challenges. But what do you consider like the top 2 or 3 challenges that our audience should be anticipating? In terms of speed bumps, with regard to market access.
Yeah, I'd say think broad from the beginning, right? It isn't too early to be thoughtful about what our payers and folks going to be most valuable. What information is going to be helpful for them, right? Yes, they want to know that it's effective, but they want to know that it's cost effective and has good clinical utility compared to what's already out there. And I think being able to, from the jump, kind of have that in your mindset early on. That would be one of the things that I would say. And then the second big important piece is try to be as collaborative and bring all those stakeholders together as early as possible to be able to get those perspectives so that no one has, kind of left behind, right? When you're developing a clinical research study, you're not hearing about, some of those payer stakeholder needs sort of after the fact. And we really should have included that in some of our questions. Hey, maybe having some patient reported outcomes from the jump would be super valuable. Let's incorporate that and be thoughtful as opposed to, hey, we just did that because it was, we could. And man, we really should have asked some very specific questions that would have been valuable to ask from the jump.
Yep. Yeah, we have a lot of clients that regret, they look back and wish they had done something
right
a little bit differently or more thoughtfully, as you just said, right, Grace? And it's not a good feeling, when you have regret, in market access. So for sure, that's great comments. All right, so next slide, please. But thank you very much, Grace. And we've got our first polling question. So within your organization, who's responsible for the evidence generation ownership? If you guys could indulge us in helping us understand your organization a little bit better. You see the choices there: medical affairs, market access, commercial, or there's some sort of shared ownership. Hopefully it's applicable, to most of you on the call, but I think you should see it pop up on your screen. If you could just quickly answer that, we will come back around to you with results of each of the 4 polling questions, just to give you guys a read on who's listening in today and what their organizations look like and are trying to do. So while we're waiting for results on that polling question, I'm going to ask Keith to step in and talk to us about learning objective number 2. Keith?
Thanks, David. So here we're going to kind of talk about the criteria payers and agency use in access decisions across the U.S., Europe, and global markets. So, kind of thinking about the similarities across the geographies as it relates to approval considerations, right? The 3 foundational blocks are really focused around safety, effectiveness, and more importantly, long-term effectiveness, and where applicable, comparative effectiveness, and also the durability, more speaking towards the medtech device arena. And then one other commonality that we want to bring up too is kind of balancing the speed of getting the product in the marketplace in relation to developing, a depth of evidence in order to get the, agency or get that approval consideration across those regulatory bodies or across, specific facilities of interest or payers of interest. So those are some similarities across those geographies. For this slide, we wanted to kind of lay out the criteria for market approval across key markets. I know some of the other panelists are going to talk about, the UK and EU specifically as we progress, right? But here, I think what we wanted to touch on is somewhat focused around kind of U.S. payer considerations as well as U.S. provider considerations when seeking coverage. From a payer perspective, right, kind of just reverting back to the previous slide, everything's founded on those, clinical evidence metrics, right? So the endpoints and outcomes of those clinical trials, along with the timeframes in which are being measured for consideration, right? Another big consideration from a clinical evidence standpoint is, does the evidence provided support, does it meet, does it resolve a significant unmet need, or does it impact, specific social determinants of health? Sometimes the volume of clinical evidence isn't always the solution, right? But being focused around the evidence strategy can sometimes be more impactful. Payers also think about kind of the market impact as they go through the coverage discussion, right? So is the product currently being adopted in the geographic area in which the payer serves? Are there KOLs that are asking for this product to be used in their panel, right, or for their population? And are they, discussing that with the payers to advocate on behalf of using the product or in order to get coverage of that product? Health economics is also an important criteria, right? Does the product show significant economic outcomes? Is it budget neutral? Does it show any savings opportunities? And then also, what's the impact to the clinical utility across the use of that product, right? Does it reduce other services across that patient care pathway? Does it replace other services, or is it additive, right? So taking those things into consideration when going and seeking coverage. Some other considerations from a payer perspective are, kind of non-US based regulatory decisions. While payers do look at that as a possibility for coverage, it's not always seen by all of the large payers. And then also the product history, right? So understanding, kind of how long has the product been around? Why hasn't it gotten coverage to date, right? Sometimes we converse with payers on a regular basis. They have a litany of information around a product because it's been trying to seek coverage for a long period of time and has been unsuccessful, right? So understanding kind of what the history is of that product. And then just speaking about, kind of provider considerations. So on the inverse, again, clinical evidence is the foundational blocks. Having a KOL advocate at a specific facility or hospital is going to be incredibly important in order to gain adoption for that provider or for that hospital, because there's a process that's called, typically run through a value access committee that review the product of interest or the technology in question to be used at the facility, and having that key opinion leader advocate on behalf of the product to show its value and applicableness for that facility and for the patient population is important. And then also from a budget impact perspective. So, understanding across that clinical unit, what is the index and kind of the downstream savings opportunities or impacts leveraging that product? What are the financial outcomes associated with that? And again, is it additive to the care pathway, or is it a replacement therapy? And then also, as value-based care continues to be a topic of conversation, is it a way in which providers can leverage this in negotiations or discussions with, the payer entities to, use it as a jumping off point for a potential value-based care discussion, right? And I think one other thing is the generalizability across provider sites. That's one thing that providers look at, right? So understanding kind of the real world effectiveness of a product outside of kind of the controlled clinical trials. Would this be applicable? Would we see the similar findings, opportunities, or outcomes associated with, the impact of this product at my facility? Is another big question. So next slide. So here I'm going to touch on this briefly, but kind of the pros and cons of RCT versus RWD, right? So RCT is a very much controlled environment, whereas real world data is not, right? And it focuses on the effectiveness in diverse patient populations. One thing from an RWD standpoint is there is a risk of missing or incomplete data. So, understanding that going into that process of accessing and leveraging real world data and in turn real world evidence, is imperative to understand that you've got a strong plan in place to assess and to fill those gaps where there may be missing data. I think one big thing and difference between RCT and RWD, and we'll touch on this as we progress, is the findings in RCT are not reflective of real life behavior, right? It's a very much a controlled environment going back to the study design. Whereas real world data is our findings of a real patient behavior and real practice patterns. So that is kind of a very different pro and con when looking at RCT versus RWD. Next slide. Yep. So I'll pass it back to you, David.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So we have our first, polling question results, and so let me just chime in with that, and then I'm going to ask Peter and Arun to take a stab at these questions that are here on the slide. But first of all, in terms of where responsibility lies within your organization for market access, the most responded response is shared ownership, which is actually can be an issue. We would recommend that while shared ownership promotes collaboration and things of that nature, it also can sometimes muddy the waters in terms of accountability. But that was the most frequent response, was shared ownership, followed by medical affairs, market access, and the commercial areas having responsibility for market access. And so that was polling question number one. Shared ownership had the most responses, and I just throw in a slight concern about that model, but certainly there can be success with that as well. And then there was and there's actually another question that's coming in from the audience, but let's get to these here on the slide first. I think, Peter, I think we're going to ask you the first question around the differences in criteria between the US, EU, and the global markets. Peter, if you want to take that one, that'd be great.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, a big topic. So inevitably, I'm going to give you somewhat of a heuristic answer, but something that I've learned in my experience working with quite a wide range of technologies is as soon as you get a level of comfort with the differences between a few technologies, it becomes much easier to handle future differences and variations you might encounter. And I think the same is true when you look at the quite diverse and in some cases fragmented types of approaches that are used in different markets, which of course can seem quite daunting, whether it's your domestic market or an overseas territory that you're looking to enter. So I guess just to start off, looking at Europe conveniently as a single whole, there are some underlying frameworks which I know Arun in particular is very conversant in. For example, the EUNet HTA, the Health Technology Assessment Framework, which tries to identify some commonality between different European countries when it comes to the approval process. I think it's also worth just recapping something that Keith mentioned, is that in European territories in particular is the concept of what's known as the competent authority. So that's a national body equivalent to the FDA who has overall responsibility and authority to approve devices to be placed on the market in their local territory. I think a common challenge in all of these markets, including I know the US, is how we can move beyond pilots of promising new therapies and technologies and move to more wide-scale routine adoption where we really expect to see the greatest benefits both on an individual and a population level. And also, while doing so, how we can, with our eyes open, start to use technology and therapies to address underlying healthcare and health inequalities that are present in today's societies, regardless of where you look. If I can pick a few specific examples. So I'd say that at a high level in the UK, the approval market access process for drugs is largely similar to that of the US. There's a fairly good level of agreement between the competent authority, and in the case of the UK, the Medicines and Health Research Authority, MHRA, and another body known as NICE, which is part of the National Health Service, whose role is to really comment and advise and approve on the basis of health economic and cost effectiveness. So for it's been widely commented over the last few years that the process can be slower in the UK than in other markets, but commensurately there have been more therapies that have been approved in the UK. So there's a bit of give and take there. However, for healthcare technology specifically, it's a widely observed fact that it takes 17 years to go from market approval to complete adoption within the National Health Service. And the reason for that is, although the National Health Service in the UK is a single body, purchasing is highly devolved. Over 200, or if not more, different decision makers just in secondary and tertiary care settings. And what that really prompts is, as David's noted earlier, from the beginning, a multifaceted evidence strategy. You're going to have to understand who a lot of different stakeholders are and what good looks like to each of them, and take the time to develop evidence that may need to be tuned and customized to different ears, different budgets, different purchasing cycles. So there is inevitably a local grassroots strategy initially, building towards a more top-down adoption model, but again, that will take time. Comparison adoption in Europe, in particularly key markets like Germany and France, has traditionally been faster. I think a dynamic worth noting overall, and going back to Keith's description of the steps in market approval a few slides ago, is that a couple of changes have really created challenges in Europe, including the UK, over the last few years. One is Brexit. And the fact that the UK no longer follows exactly the same regulatory and market approval approach that the rest of mainland Europe does. And the second of which is the transition a few years ago now, although the shockwaves are still being felt, between what was the old medical device directive to the newer medical device regulation. The practical impact of that change in regulation was a lot of the organizations who were franchised by these competent authorities, so again, the notified bodies that Keith mentioned on his slide, no longer had the required qualifications to continue to assess individual devices on the behalf of those competent authorities and give manufacturers the green light for market access. So essentially, there's been a long queue building up over the last few years, which is only starting to ebb away in terms of capacity of those notified bodies. So that's a dynamic that's worth considering. However, on the bright side, there are numerous accelerated access programs operating in particular countries. For example, the HTA in France, and in other territories, typically focused around things like rare diseases or other larger scale priority areas, for example, diabetes or oncology. There are also specific initiatives that can help accelerate the adoption of technologies. A good example of that is the DIGA regulations in Germany, which were specifically put into law to make it possible for physicians to prescribe digital health as part of a treatment plan. And in the UK and in other countries, there's been technology-specific funding, for example, around the use of artificial intelligence. Of course, looking back to the US, there's some great examples. For example, the biomarker qualification programs that the RSNA and the FDA support, which are directly relevant to new in vitro diagnostics and also the accelerated clinical trials of therapies. I think another consideration that payers and providers are going to be looking at much more explicitly going forwards is around sustainability. The NHS, an example, has set some aggressive, although some would argue not aggressive enough, targets for net zero, and that has an impact on procurement and the way in which technologies and medicines are both manufactured and also managed and disposed of. And then I think a fundamental requirement is, if we're to look at value-based healthcare models, what that calls for is real-world evidence available across the relevant patient journey. And that in turn then means that some of the limitations we have in today's healthcare systems in first world as well as other markets in terms of the interoperability of data, the cradle to grave or full patient journey models need to be overcome. So manufacturers working with data providers and ensuring that they're able to map patient outcomes over the longer term, not just in secondary but also primary care settings, is going to be a really important thing. And then I think a final note on this, looking to the near future, an interesting opportunity is going to be in the UK, because as a result of splitting away from Europe, the MHRA, again our competent authority, have said that they're going to start accepting accelerated approvals for therapies and devices that have been already approved in other markets, including the US and Japan. Now that legislation is to take clearer shape this year, so I think that'll be a really interesting area for manufacturers to look at closely to see how they can play out existing approvals into the UK and potentially other markets going forwards.
Great. Thank you, Peter. That's excellent. So I was going to pivot to the other question, and Arun, I was going to ask you to chime in on this one. How can life sciences companies ensure that their evidence meets agency and payer needs? And then, as a backdrop to that, Arun, there is an audience question, and it's for all the panelists, right? But I'm going to put it out there now before Arun you start responding. But how have you been able to, the question is, how have you been successful leveraging RWE in a world where RCTs hold the most weight, right? So I think, RCTs have been the gold standard almost since the beginning of time. We should discuss whether that ship is turning and whether it's becoming less of the gold standard. But the question is, how do you leverage RWE in a world that really still values the RCT the most?
Sure.
So.
Thanks, David. I think just following on from Peter's comments too, in terms of differences, I'll try to cover pretty much both the questions that we have on the screen. So for life sciences companies, the way I see it, the agency payer evidence requirements perhaps becomes one of the key risks that they need to manage when they're looking to commercialize products. So I think that's the critical kind of the evidence needs that agency and payers have is the key that they need to almost focus on. How do they focus on it? Well, they need to have the right kind of evidence strategies to mitigate for it. Broadly, in US and in Europe, while there are notable differences in emphasis that countries have in terms of evidence, broadly there is a consensus, if you can call it out, in terms of what that evidence means. It's about long-term effect of treatments. It's about comparative effectiveness of treatments. And that's pretty much the theme that you see across the markets when we look at evidence. So in terms of companies looking to bring a product to the market, as Grace also mentioned, the key really is the need to balance this need for speed in terms of go-to-market with the need to have a depth in terms of their evidence and looking at it holistically for the product launch success. Now, we can see almost all of this in play when we look at some of the innovative therapies that are being fast-tracked by the FDA as well as the EMA under the conditional marketing approval programs or FDA's accelerated approval programs. Now, even after gaining market approval with quality pivotal trial data, they don't gain the final eventual reimbursement that they seek, mainly due to the absence of good real-world evidence of clinical effectiveness. So that is seen, for example, when you look at the recent paper which looked into this exact question in the Lancet, and that showed that over 27 drugs for cancer indications were withdrawn since 2011, mainly because of lack of adequate data around the risk benefit that these products have in the long term. So a large reason for some of the gaps that exist in this manner is mainly because manufacturers emphasize quite a bit on data from clinical trials, RCTs, and that becomes almost a point at which a go-no-go decision is made. And there is lack of emphasis pretty much on data around effectiveness of products in the long term, in the real world, in routine care, be it, and tracking endpoints such as overall survival or quality of life. So moving away from the surrogate endpoints down to, as well as single-arm trials, for example, down to RCT-controlled or RCT-anchored study designs, external control arms, and such is absolutely key, I believe, in terms of ensuring that the evidence that payers and agencies are seeking to get the right reimbursement decisions, which, as again, is the key point at which most commercialization of product sits. So evidence strategies can help mitigate that, and I think that's where I think the focus needs to be. So to answer both the questions in a broad sense, I think the focus really needs to be early evidence strategies, and to make sure that those evidence strategies look not just at RCTs, but also look at how RCTs can also start look at real-world evidence gathering using methods which are commonly which are being now talked of in EU NET HTA conversations, the JCA conversation, for example, in Europe. So there are methods such as indirect comparison methods, for example, that have been described. Synthetic control arms are being described. MAIC methods are being described, and these methods are key to the answer that we seek here.
Great. Thanks, Arun. Those are great points for sure. So if we could go to the next slide. Here's polling question number 2, and then I'm going to throw my 2 cents into the audience question and see if anybody else wants to chime in while we wait for these results. But the polling question: how has your company used RWE for payer and/or provider adoption? And there's your choices: RWE to support payer outreach, RWE to impact purchasing decisions within hospitals or networks. Multiple options, none of the above are not applicable. So if you could again indulge us in responding to polling question number 2 here, we'll circle back and share results, as soon as we can. So, and then on the question, and certainly I think pretty much everybody has probably some thoughts on the question from the audience around, how does RWE become effective in an RCT centric world? My 2 cents on that is that, in the med tech world, I think RCTs are becoming less entrenched, than it is in the pharma world. And I open it up to the panel to challenge that. But on the med tech side, there are examples of where a collection or a campaign of RWE studies have moved the needle, with the payers specifically, without necessarily having an RCT, right? So does RWE replace RCT? Likely not, right? It's often complementary, but there are examples and precedents where a collection of RWE studies, not one, right? You're not gonna have one RWE study replace an RCT, right? But if you strategize and thoughtfully do a collection of RWE studies, coming at it from different angles and showing generalizability, because I think one of the things that the payers are really focused on is, if I approve this technology in a clinical trial, it might have just been tertiary sites that were involved in it, but I really want to know how this technology would perform across multiple provider types and systems, right? And that's where RWE can really play very well, to the payer audiences around generalizability. So, so a little bit of kind of a perspective there, and I think I'll offer to my colleagues as they come up next in the discussion to maybe comment on that as well. So next slide, please. So, objective number 3, I'm going to ask Peter to take us through objective number 3. So Peter, you want to take it from here?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so if we can move to the next slide, we're going to talk about how evidence generation strategies need to reflect the role of real-world data for access success. And I think, and this does link directly to the question we had earlier, the first point I want to reflect in terms of this slide is that Rome wasn't built in a day. Evidence generation will take time, and it's probably going to be an ongoing and fluid process. But as you probably heard earlier in today's session, it's absolutely essential to think about what I would call the evidence roadmap very early in the development process of any new therapeutic or device, ideally right at the beginning. And there's a couple of really good reasons for that. I think it can be tempting to think of development, whether it's for a new drug or a new technology, as a linear process with a beginning and an end. Even as you can see on the slide, the line is not straight from left to right. But I think really what we should be considering is that the development process is in a circle, and what that drives is an inherently iterative approach, whether we're looking to offer our intervention to more populations or with more utility or across more therapeutic areas. And an iterative approach very directly mandates an approach that's supported by real-world evidence throughout. So at the earliest stages of any kind of development in the healthcare or life sciences space, it's absolutely essential that you have an understanding of the way in which the new intervention will likely be delivered. And that will allow you to identify who are the key decision makers, the physicians, the patients, of course, the payers, but also the regulators and others around the technology. That's both important in terms of reaching your end goal of demonstrating what good looks like to all of those groups in the way that makes the most compelling sense to them, but also in the interim, really critical to make sure that as you try to solve these really, really hard problems in health, global health and life sciences, that you're able to catalyze the kind of consortia that you need, with experts from their respective fields coming together, all fueled and motivated and empowered by the evidence you collect as you go along the way. Yeah, again, thinking really about the post-launch phase, real-world evidence collection is motivated not only by your obligation as a manufacturer to carry out post-market surveillance or pharmacovigilance, but as we've heard already, in order to demonstrate the cost effectiveness in a much more mixed and heterogeneous environment of payers, patients, and healthcare delivery models, whether we're looking within domestic boundaries or across international markets. And therefore, this proactive development of market therapies and diagnostics can be driven by a number of different factors. So you in addition to handling the wider variability and uncertainty that you get as you get exposed to a much larger patient and provider population, you may want to expand the indications for your drug across a wider population or additional therapeutic areas. That's where real-world evidence can really help you move forwards. In the specific example of using technologies which we like to call artificial intelligence or data in diagnostics, we know that there's the potential for these software solutions to learn and improve once they're exposed to more and more data. And again, in the context of making sure that we're able to equally serve diverse populations, that can be a good thing if steered in the right way. But we need to validate that once out in the field, that these technologies are improving within their intended use. They're not silently deteriorating just because they're allowed to change dynamically. So, for example, the FDA guidance in collaboration with Health Canada and the MHRA recently around what they call change control plans for software as a medical device is really key for manufacturers to understand how once on the market, they can continue to positively develop their technologies in a way that can serve larger and larger populations, again, all underpinned by real evidence. And I think the way in which you do that, the data itself, for example, patient-reported outcomes that can support a real-world evidence strategy, have a direct applicability to how you can add more value to the patient and the provider. So, for example, the data that you collected can drive new approaches using those patient-reported outcomes on how to maintain really good adherence to or engagement to treatment programs. And also, in doing so, uncover new pathways that can allow you to access patients for whom traditional pathways don't get to them. If we then move to the next slide, this is just, again, a landscape depiction of some of the approaches that can be taken to go from those RCTs to real compelling evidence of real-world utility. And we've heard from the other speakers, partly in response to the question from the audience around the reasons why you do that. I would add colour to that, if not substance, to say that I think there's a wide understanding these days that too many promising therapies and technologies are stuck in pilot mode, either localized to a particular hospital or a particular healthcare context. And partly the reason for that is fundamentally randomized controlled trials are conducted in a very controlled environment, which doesn't reflect the variability that we see in the real world. So it's absolutely essential that we can generalize and adapt and mitigate anything that comes with that uncertainty as we roll out outside of that carefully controlled RCT and scientifically driven environment. So at a practical level, the team that you're hearing from today and the wider team is very experienced in applying real-world data to build out the evidence bases that are initially collected through RCTs. There's a very wide range of validated approaches that can be brought to bear in order to more strongly link trial results to real-world outcomes, both short and long term. I know Arun and Keith are going to pick up on some detailed examples in subsequent slides, but for me, some high-level benefits at this point include mapping point-in-time interventions in the patient journey with their impact on the overall disease diagnosis and progression throughout the full patient journey. I think particularly with novel diagnostics, there's a temptation to think that you're replacing one link in the chain. And if you can do that to the accepted accuracy standard of the best physician in the world, let's say the ability to detect a cancer in an MRI scan, then that is generally the evidence base. But I think people now understand that you've got to consider the upstream and downstream effects. You have to take a systems engineering approach. If you have a new diagnostic that's better at detecting cancer, well, have you thought about how people with stage 1 cancer are going to deal with the fact that they've been told they may have cancer at a very early stage? Have you also thought about how radiologists upstream of that new automated diagnosis are going to handle the increased number of suspicious scans that they have to second read? So understanding the system, the patient journey, and then understanding that you cannot evidence that entire journey unless you take on real-world evidence is really key to successful market access. We touched on it again, but I think it's a really important topic. Real-world evidence can be used to extend inherently limited trial cohorts to adequately represent diverse populations that reflect today's inequalities and inequities in healthcare provision, and also the wider range of phenotypes that you simply access by becoming exposed to a much larger population, particularly as we start to think about the impact of genomic medicine and how we can start to manage pharmacogenomic responses in a more principled and accurate way. And finally, there's a real opportunity, Arun's touched on this, for leveraging historical data to very quickly stand up statistically robust virtual cohorts of patients, again, against which prospective intervention groups can be compared. And we've seen increasing examples of the regulators, such as the FDA, accepting those virtual arms as part of the evidence base that's been submitted for the approval of new therapies. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Next slide, please. So, as we manage time and try to land this plane, no pun intended, but I guess United Airlines hasn't called yet, Peter. But I'm just going to ask one of these questions, and I'm going to ask it of Arun. And Arun, I'm just going to ask you to keep your comments pretty efficient, right, around that first question. What are ways RWE can complement traditional clinical data with the audience question in mind?
Yeah.
And then we'll move to the third and fourth polling questions. And Keith, I know, we're also going to ask you to talk about ROI for a minute or two as well. But we need to keep moving here. But go ahead, Arun, on that first question.
Yeah. So I'll cover the audience question too. So essentially, the way we see it, the RCTs, of course, hold most weight, absolutely, and they do. Because it is probably the best approach to provide the data around clinical efficacy. The construct of it is exactly what is sought by agencies, by regulatory agencies, but also for reimbursement, but also by payers. But at the same time, there is increasing realization that the treatments that patients use and need essentially are delivered in the real world, and the real world dynamics, of course, needs to be also factored in. The treatment effect, therefore, in the long term, for example, the patient experience, the patient outcomes, which is also in the real world, also needs to be factored in, and that realization is also very much there. So real data as such is becoming certainly a key component. Now, real world by its very nature is quite dynamic. It's quite patchy. There is a need, as Keith mentioned before in his slide, the need to control for the bias that exists that in real world. And that is certainly something which the agencies kind of look for in terms of the robustness of the evidence that you present. So there is need to move away from some of the suboptimal approaches of single-arm studies and surrogate endpoints, for instance. There is also, as I said before, a broad consensus being built in the EU around the EU NET-JCA, the Joint Clinical Effectiveness Assessment that is coming into play in 2025, where such approaches such as indirect comparison methods, for example, is suddenly being acknowledged as the need of the hour. What is being talked of is methods such as synthetic control arms, studies where we simulate RCT cohorts, like you saw and heard from Peter, in terms of extended studies, studies which use Bayesian modeling and propensity matching, for instance, wherein you look at extrapolating RCT cohorts into the real world by regulatory grade modeling. So there are approaches we can deploy, statistical approaches, which is also being acknowledged by agencies, and that's the good news. So it's certainly some advanced statistics, it's advanced methods, early planning, early evidence strategy planning, which together can move the needle in terms of how we can look at bringing together both RCT as well as real world data.
Great, thanks, Arun. Next slide, please. I think polling question number 3, and in the next 5 minutes, we're going to come at you with polling question number 4. This one is the opposite of a trick question. It is a very basic question, so I'm not even going to necessarily read the answers to you, but have you used RWE to influence regulatory decisions? Let us know. And polling question number 2, the most frequent response was that you use RWE to address multiple options and stakeholders, not just payers, not just providers, not just regulators, but it appears as though you're taking our advice and you're trying to use RWE to influence multiple options, which was the option on polling question number 2 that was had the most frequent response, right? So please, complete polling question number 3, and we'll move on. I'm going to ask Keith to, tie things up here pretty quickly, and then we're going to get you to polling question number 4 here in the next couple of minutes. Go ahead, Keith.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so just in the sake of time, what we're going to talk about here is ways in which organizations, or what can organizations do to increase ROI from evidence. So next slide. One way to do that is to decrease the time to market, right? So thinking about the RWE impact on the market access timeline, right, and how that can change or impact the overall ROI, right? So here's a few examples. So kind of going from left to right around the spoke. Simulate real world outcomes, right? So we've talked about this a little bit in the sense of clinical trial data is very controlled, right? So in order to simulate those real world outcomes by combining real world data and clinical trial data to better understand the applicability and the outcomes across a more diverse patient population and less restrictive inclusion criteria to better understand real world impact. And then expedite long-term effectiveness assessments, right? So running simulations to better understand, how that long-term effectiveness is, right? Better understanding exactly how the product will perform over a longer period of time or longer duration of time. So leveraging some clinical data in conjunction with real-world data to better understand that. And then, synthetic control arm development, right? So, sometimes trial data doesn't necessarily have or allow a control arm. So creating that synthetic control arm using real world evidence or data based on inclusion-exclusion criteria across, the trial of interest is going to be important in, reducing those timeline impacts from a market access perspective. So, 3 specific examples, ways in which you can impact the timeline and therefore impact the ROI.
Nice. So I'm going to, Keith, if we have time, but I'm going to go to the polling question number 4 here and make sure that we get that in, because we are coming up on, depending upon your time zone, 59 minutes after the hour. So polling question number 4, does your organization consider ROI when developing RWE? And you can see the responses there. And if you respond to this and you've responded to all 4, you're going to be eligible for your CPE credit that we promised you for sure. So we are delivering on that promise of CPE, as well as delivering some wisdom on market access. And then the response to polling question number 3, was that looked like the most frequent responses that 40%, roughly, actually more than that, said that they have not tried to influence regulatory decisions with RWE. And in fact, really, if I do some quick math, it's probably more like 60 or 70% of you said you haven't tried. And so, certainly that's reflective of the market right now, but just wanted to get a read on the audience there is for sure. So this is the final polling question. And I think the next slide, is really just kind of a wrap up. We thank you for your time today. We're coming right up to the top of the hour here. I don't know if anyone has any final comments, but I'm probably going to just wrap it up here and say that thank you very much to our panel and very much appreciate everybody's perspective. Robert, thank you for the question that you gave us out there. And if you'd like to reach us directly, here's all of our contact information. If you want to hear more about RCTs versus RWE, any of you, can certainly reach out at the emails that we've got here. We'd be happy to have further dialogue with you guys on that front. And again, thank you for your attention today. So that'll do it for us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.